where do you fall in terms of how you might structure and the nuance as well, because it's almost a lazy question to say what's the best diet for humans, because there is no one. The best diet is the one that you can stick to over the long term. And that's going to really vary depending on a whole host of things, all the things, the social aspect that you talked about, your sleep, all of the things that we might be doing, internal and external factors. So what are some of maybe I'll reframe it and say, what are some of the considerations that you think about when you are designing, let's say, a diet for a patient? And we can include everything from genetic polymorphisms to autoimmunity to like all of the things. What are some ways that you think about designing a nutrition program for someone?
The first consideration would be how likely is the patient to adhere to this diet? And then what time frame are you looking at? So are you excluding certain things from like a both diagnostic and therapeutic approach and then seeing how they respond to it? Or is this not really even a diet at all, which is the best diet, of course, just a lifestyle change where they will adhere to that indefinitely? And then the other thing to take into account is what is the situation that this patient is in? So this could factor in anything from cost, like socioeconomic situations. It could factor in food deserts. Do they have, like if they're not able to get groceries shipped to their doorstep, is there a place that has the things that they would like to diet with? It also factors in different pathologies and disease states. Celiac is a very easy one to point out. Avoidance of gluten. So, there's a lot of different variations of that. Another thing that you mentioned is, do they have, and it's not necessarily just SNPs. So a SNP is a single nucleotide polymorphism, for those that are wondering. It's basically a change in one letter. Think of your genome as an Encyclopedia Britannica. A SNP is a change of one letter in one word of one paragraph of one chapter of one book of the encyclopedia. They do happen to be the most commonly changed letters, and they can be clinically significant, but usually one SNP in and of itself, so you're talking about like nutrigenomics or whatever you want to call it, is not as clinically applicable as like what the labs are looking like. A good example is MTHFR. It's a very common one. It's certainly clinically significant, but there's several different SNPs that you can have, but it's not just the 4 most commonly checked SNPs. You can have many other mutations in the gene, but at the end of the day, you're still going to follow a B12 and a folate and a homocysteine and maybe an MMA, which is methylmalonic acid, basically assessing your methylation function. And depending on that, then you can make dietary changes or supplements. And for that matter, you can almost always make a dietary change instead of a supplement. Sometimes it's just more difficult. So that kind of gets into the nuance of incorporating diet as medicine. I'm a strong believer that food is medicine, and many things can be treated with dietary changes. It's actually how they discovered pernicious anemia being due to, I believe, B12 and folate deficiencies. They prescribed a diet, and this was 100 years ago.
And I think the other thing to consider, albeit a temporary one, is, do you feel better on this diet? Is it helping with your joint pain, let's say? And I'll bring up autoimmunity because I often will start with a therapeutic intervention. They don't stay here, but I will often put them on a very low, if not a no carb or carbohydrate diet temporarily. And then we often see things like joint pain resolution. We might see that morning puffiness or sluggishness ameliorated, and a whole host of other things. So I also like to look at biofeedback of the patient as well. Like, do you feel better? Because what invariably happens, of course, is if they stay on that intervention for too long, they sort of, I like to say, sort of ride the air, like they ride the wave under the curve, right? Like they sort of like they sort of ride out that maximal benefit that they're going to have from that intervention. And then they start feeling worse. And unfortunately, what I find in terms of the psychology of the patient, what they end up thinking is, oh, well, you know what, I'm not I've been slipping up on my carnivore a little bit. Like I really need to tighten that up. Or I've been, maybe I'm not doing my keto the way that I was when and they sort of double down on the intervention when really what is required is now a change in the intervention. Like they've sort of ridden out the maximal benefit that they're going to derive from it. Would you agree with that? Is that something that you've observed as well?
Yeah, there's definitely a biofeedback or subjective component. Incorporating the objective data with the subjective data, whether you're monitoring a medication, a supplement, or a dietary change, is very important. That made me think of a interesting phenomenon, and this would go under the art of the practice of medicine, is recognizing patterns and phenotypes. For example, if there's a patient, if they're like a fertility patient or recurrent miscarriage or whatnot, there's certainly patterns. For example, like where on the hypothalamic amenorrhea spectrum is that patient, where on the PCOS spectrum is that patient. And the same thing is true of diet. For example, there's this phenotype of low BMI, in general, low body mass, whether it's lean or body fat, and lots of autoimmunity, maybe Hashimoto's and Crohn's, maybe something else as well. And they respond extremely well to very low carb diets, even carnivore diets. So there's certainly a phenotype that perhaps we don't know exactly why that is always the case, but I definitely see it in clinical practice.